Disclaimer, just have fun and take all that with this, not a grain of salt, but I don't know, like a grain of sugar or something like that, to just enjoy yourself. All right, let's get started. So what are we talking about? Dimensions in D&D. So obviously, the focus of the workshop is going to be on time, and how do you highlight and emphasize time moving forward, sort of historical time, in your D&D session as a GM. And in that respect, time is the fourth dimension, in relation to the first, second, and third, sort of physically. So I was thinking, what are some other dimensions that I could think of through D&D? What are your sort of gradual increments of moving as a GM in terms of what it is that you're presenting to the players? So on the one hand, one of the first things that people sort of gravitate towards naturally, which does sort of make sense, there is some validity there, is there's a mechanical component. As the GM, you're responsible for the mechanical dimension of the game. You've got to know the rules somewhat, not necessarily be the rules guru. The whole party can help with that, but you've got to you're the one who's working as the arbiter. If there's a rule question or problem that comes up, if there's a debate, if people disagree on something, eventually you're the one who gets to come down and decide on what the ruling is going to be for that session, and if it's going to persist afterwards, if you'll look it up between sessions. So the GM does manage the mechanical stuff sort of first. So then once you move in from mechanics into the storytelling aspect of the game, the GM is responsible for the sort of physicality of the game. So, your 5 friends sitting around a table. In order for you to feel like you are not sitting around a table, you need physical descriptions. So you need the smell, the texture, the visuals, the sort of taste, everything about the environment that you're in, what it feels like when you get hit by certain attacks or wounds, all the sensations, the sort of sensory data, all sort of rolls into that second dimension. And that's sort of the immersion piece. That's putting you in a story, whether or not there's actually a story going on, whether or not there's compelling characters, whether or not there's a villain or a plot arc. In order to sort of be in the game, you need that physical dimension in terms of what the GM is going to be describing or contributing to the players. Next, which is sort of the next logical step, when I was thinking through, how would I write out D&D dimensions? After your physical descriptions, okay, we've got our mechanics, we understand how our conceptual characters are represented on a page, and now we understand how those characters are placed into a world because we have these physical sensory descriptions. The next piece is the emotional stuff. So what are the motivations of the characters? What are the defining sort of moments in their lives? What is it that they aspire towards? What is it that they hate? What are some of their goals or sort of credences, things that they follow? And then over time, what are the relationships that they have? So who do they know in the world? Do they have family members anywhere sort of still alive? Have they got connections, business connections, friendly connections, enemies, nemesis, that sort of thing? Obviously, they've got a party. You've got other adventurers that you're connected to emotionally in some capacity. So that's sort of the next level of depth in terms of your GM putting the players into a game that they can involve themselves with. Thank you, Double O Crush, for the follow. You are a gentleman or gentlewoman and a scholar, and it's good to have you. Welcome to the adventure, my friend. We are doing a Dungeon Masters workshop where we're just talking theory stuff on GM concepts, and after we're going to do some D&D and chill, answer some questions. And then I think Will's got some Curse of Strahd prep so that you guys can know what's coming for the players when we play Curse of Strahd on Wednesday. So you can be one step ahead of the game, but no spoilers in chat, because sometimes our players check chat for spoilers. All right, so you've got, as the GM, you lay down the mechanics. What system are we playing? How are we actually going to play this game in the first place? You've got the physical descriptions. Put your characters in the world, put them in the space. And then sort of connect them or tether them to that space by adding an emotional dimension. And then the next, and again, there could be other dimensions. It's not an exclusive list. The order may not be perfect. But since I was going with the fourth dimension of time, I needed 3 others. So now we hit number 4, and now we're on time. So the temporal or the historical dimension of the game. And this is a really important one that, once you've done a really good job laying down the sort of physical descriptions of spaces and the emotional tethering or connections between players and NPCs, players and each other, players in the world, a lot of times the temporal or the historical element kind of functions on its own. If you never thought about it and never tried to deliberately highlight or enhance it, then it would still function. It would still be there. The characters would still develop relationships. that would change over time. You know, the sort of the elongated plot arc is still a sense of, you know, the world changes over the course of that plot arc. Things happen. So there is a sense of like historicity. You know, the characters are in a world, they're in a certain timeline. If you've gone so far in your world building that you have like a year or like a calendar, you know, they can track their progression that way. So I've always found that like the temporal element kind of exists in the background, which is why it doesn't get sort of deliberately like, you know, wrestled with quite as often as, you know, there's tons of stuff online about how to write captivating physical descriptions, how to develop really, really compelling emotional connections. But the time stuff, how do you work with time? So that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully it'll make some kind of sense. And if not, who cares? Because we're just hanging out. If you have fun playing D&D, just keep playing D&D. So why would you want to emphasize time? You know, if what I said before is that it's always there, you know, you give your players a plot arc, they move along that plot arc, they're semi-conscious at all times that their character is older at the end than they were at the beginning, that the world has one less bad guy than it had before, that, you know, that town got sacked en route to killing the bad guy. They're aware of those things anyway. So what's the point of doing extra work? You know, God forbid GMs have to prep. What's the point of doing extra work to emphasize time? So what's the value? So on the one hand, it gives you a bigger world. You know, lots of GMs will map and plan their setting in a sort of spatial dimension, like to exhaustive levels of detail. They've got continents and regions and topography and climate bands, a whole lot of detail that they put into the physical space. And they'll have a couple ideas and paragraphs of like major events within a chronology or a timeline. They'll have a rough sense of, you know, how much technology there is in the world, where is society sort of developmentally. Sometimes they'll think through those things, but there's a little bit more that can be done if you really start to expand the sort of growth and development of every aspect. You know, as much work as you do spatially, there should or can be a sort of parallel amount of work that you do when talking about the sort of historical space. So you develop the space, but that whole space has an entire history that gets tacked onto it. You know, okay, this village is here, I've got the NPCs, I've got the shop, I've got the defenses. Okay, well, how long has the village been there? Why was the village first settled there to begin with? What sort of major events have passed through the village? The major players that live there, have they always lived there? What's their sort of chronology? So there's a lot of expansive stuff you can do when you start considering the sort of before my adventurers got here and after my adventurers are gone, this village still has eventful things happen to it. The party or the adventurers are not the center of the universe. And I guess maybe that's like the refrain for this whole, you know, expanding time or emphasizing the time dynamic in your setting, is by making your players feel like they're not necessarily the center of the universe, which doesn't mean they're not saving the world. You can still be saving the world and not be the center of the universe. By making the players very aware of the fact that they're not the center of this game setting, then all of a sudden the setting is just so much bigger, there's so much more going on, there's lots that's out of their control. You know, once you start showing them that events happen that they didn't even get the opportunity to stop or to aid or to help happen or to influence or make a decision, you realize that the world is much more organic and dynamic and bigger in a way that following a breadcrumb trail where there's just never a dragon attacking the next town, and so you're just always moving through and all the eventful things just sort of coalesce on the party. By emphasizing time, that's not really the case. So you end up with a bigger world, first of all. When you start doing your GM prep, you start thinking historically, you realize that it's quite a rabbit hole. You know, like all aspects of GM prep, if you really dive into it, it is a near infinite depth or amount of work that you can do. So you do have to put a stop to it, but it is something to think about in terms of, if I'm going to spend 40 hours cumulative on designing a map, maybe spend 30 hours on the map and 10 hours, you know, playing with some of these ideas in terms of what are some of the main historical events that have populated a certain area, what defines, you know, a certain people based on their history rather than just their location and their function for your adventurers. So another reason to emphasize time is a compelling story, of course. So you've got this group of adventurers that is sort of, you know, trying to stay motivated to do a certain task or follow a plot that you've given them. And a lot of times they have different motivations. You've got a party of 5 heroes, each of whom cares for a very different reason about what they're doing, and they just kind of try to not talk about it that often so that they can just get the job done and achieve what it is that they need individually. And that's fine, that's okay. But when you have a world that gets changed by what the PCs do, which is the next piece, so we'll talk about increasing player influence. When you create a world that is so much more affected by what the players do, and that's not, again, not to say that it's not going to be affected already, but if the effect of a player showing up to a town to slay the dragon isn't just that the town is saved right then, but the effect moves in both directions historically or in time, now, forever onwards, that town is going to have this connection or this association with that PC. They're going to be the ones that have been saved from the dragon. Maybe the dragon blew up 6 or 7 other towns on the way to this town, so now they become the economic hub because they're the only one left. They start to boom, the party comes back, it's this sprawling metropolis, yada, yada, yada. So we'll get into the mechanics of things to do for it, but the idea is your players' actions are going to be more important because you're going to be thinking about how they're important, not just right now, while the player is there doing the action, but how is the party's influence on this location going to persist and continue and evolve and like shape this location in a certain way. So that's going to make a more compelling story, because when your PCs are confronted with how impactful they are and how like significant their actions are in this sort of historical sense, suddenly they're going to be much more conscious and careful when they take actions, because they know, okay, whoa, remember that last time that we, burned down that farm because, we wanted to kill the goblins and we thought it's just one farm. Not a big deal. We were aware of the consequence of our actions in the immediate, but we weren't thinking about the sort of historical consequences. And then this extra bad thing happened from what we did that took 3 or 4 months to develop. Then when they start to take actions, they're going to realize, ooh, we need to be a little bit more careful, more cautious. We need to think more in terms of this world as being a very sort of, again, think like butterfly effect. You want them to have that sense, maybe not to that extreme, but if your party is aware that their actions can cascade, then their characters feel so much more tapped into like the pulse of the world at its core or at its heart. So it makes for a more compelling story. So increased PC influence obviously is sort of what we were talking about, and that ties right into increasing your player investment. If they feel that their actions are that much more impactful on the world, they're going to take more care in deciding what it is that they want to do and moving forward. And it's going to produce this compelling story where they're constantly trying to grapple with all the implications of what it is that they're doing, which makes for a lot more tangles. I talk a lot about tangles, between party members, between characters and their NPCs, characters and settings. The more tangles you have, the more rich opportunities you've got for story. So those are some reasons on why you would want to emphasize time, even though it exists anyway, kind of in the background, on why you'd want to emphasize the sort of historic dynamic or dimension to your GM prep or your GM setting. So what are some ways to emphasize time? How, I guess, is this part of it. So we've talked about why, we've talked about what. So now how do you actually achieve an increased player awareness of the historical sort of atmosphere or dimension to the world that they're playing in? So the big one that sort of applies to all 4 of these is you want off-screen action. So the players and their characters only ever see what happens to the party. So the big thing to emphasize sort of historic time, or like the historic dimension in your game, is to have things happen that have nothing to do with the party, but have a sense of when they're happening in relation to what the party's doing. So your GM prep, should be not just, okay, I'm going to plan the very narrow bowling alley that the party is going to be going on, or I'm going to plan for, to have a suite of improvisational tools so I can just be carving out a bowling alley that the party makes if you've got a party that takes a lot of agency. But even just that focused on, I only need to worry about prepping what's around the party. Take a couple minutes every time you prep a session and think, okay, who are the NPCs they've met before? What are the other players in this region? Who's doing what? Who cares about what? What are the motivations? What are the conflicts? What's like an event that can happen off screen during this session? And have at least one off-screen event every session that the party has no idea about and that they're eventually going to find out has happened. And sometimes they can be related to things that the parties have done directly. so sort of they're a direct consequence of a decision that your players made. But sometimes they can be completely independent. You know, the party met a certain diplomat and spent 2 or 3 sessions, you know, working with their, you know, militia, and, you know, did all these tasks, and now they're moving on to the next village. 2 or 3 sessions later, one of the militia captains, you know, gets assassinated in a back alley for like a gambling thing that was going on that the party didn't know about. That's not necessarily their fault. They didn't do anything to stop it, but the next time they come through, there's going to have been changes and consequences because of something that happened off screen. So you want to get the party aware of the fact that their little bubble that they adventure in is not the only bubble wherein the world takes place. Things don't, you know, it's not like a video game where the world isn't happening while you're not there, and it's only as you enter that zone that the enemies are sort of like spawning, populating, and like doing the thing that you want to encounter them doing, but they're sort of not doing it to the world when you're gone. So having those off-screen actions happen is great. And so once you've had an off-screen action occur, how do you show the party that an off-screen action has occurred? How do you have them realize it? How do you sort of reveal that something has gone on? And how do you incorporate that a little bit? So we're going to talk about 4 things. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's not the sort of be-all and end-all. Thank you, the Black Sphinx 666, for the host. These 4 things are just sort of my favorites, I guess. They're my favorite ways to remind players that the world is continuing to churn when they're not there. And that means the whole world, not just the little bubble that follows them through their columns of story or plot. So recurring locations, recurring NPCs, downtime, and branching plot decisions. So we're going to talk about each of these 4 things as a way to help emphasize the sort of historic dimension to your D&D setting, so the players don't think that they're just playing through levels that were prepped within the last 3 days. They'll feel like their characters are in a world, and they need to be a little bit more careful when they make their decisions. The Black Sphinx, you said you've stopped in once or twice. Cool, it's good to have you. We are in our Dungeon Masters workshop where we just sort of chill, hang out, talk about some cool ideas, brainstorming stuff for GMs. We've got some D&D and chill right after this. Will and I are just going to do some Q&A, answer some questions, and then I think we've got some DM prep. Will's going to work on some Strahd for Wednesday, so if you want some spoilers, if you want to know what the players are going to be encountering before they do this Wednesday, you can tune in for that as well. Alrighty. So let's talk about recurring locations. So the first point, so here's some ways to think about, okay, you've decided I want to emphasize historical time, the historical dimension, that mug, that chai tea. You want to emphasize the historical dimension, and you want to do it with locations. You've got some really captivating settings. Maybe you're not super into NPCs. You just love like really rich textured cities or locations. So that's how you want to focus on emphasizing time. So the first thing that I'll say is, don't be afraid to reuse locations, not just within travel, but as like a central place. As a new event, there's a new plot point happening in the same place where you had another plot point. A lot of GMs, because they tend to design these enormous fucking maps, and I'm guilty of this too, there's this sort of like subconscious impulse to, I guess it's like you don't want to waste time planning a session that takes place in a setting that they've already been to, because you've got so many other cool places that you want them to go to. So it's like, cool, I want this to be a different city or forest or dungeon every time we have a session, because I just have so many and we're never going to get through them. I don't want to like waste a session by going back to the same city. One thing would just be to let go of that, because it can be really, really fun and really compelling to deliberately have another adventure, another set of plot points occur in a location that the party is familiar with. But what I'll say is, do it a little bit removed. So put some time between the two sort of periods when the party is going to be there, because then when they come back, you may think, oh, it's the same city because it's like the one with this name and these features as opposed to the other cities. But the point is, when the party comes back, it's not going to be the same setting. So you want there to have been changes, and that's what will make it feel new. That's what will make it interesting. And that's when you'll have a lot of opportunities to sort of stretch out and like show the party that the world goes on without them, and time keeps on ticking, baby. So big and small changes is one. So you definitely want to have a little bit of both, not just one or the other. Obviously, if there have been no major events, maybe wait a bit more before coming back to that city. But having sort of major components that have shifted, whether it's a different person in power, a new captain of the guard that's a bit more draconian. Maybe it's a summer season and it's a drought, so there's a lot less food. Maybe there's a plague going through the city. All these different things that are happening that, again, the party didn't do. It's not their fault, but the city is different in a big way. But then you want to think of how that being different in a big way is going to have small changes. So there's a sort of major, like, central line that you'll think, okay, we're going back to city A, but there's a plague. Cool, so that'll be different. But what are the small changes that are going to result from that if there's a plague in your city? So there's going to be a lot more corpses out in the streets. There's going to be, piles of burning bodies, all these textured details. So you go back to your emotional and your physical and your mechanical dimensions, and you have this historical or temporal dimension change them. So your emotional dimension, some NPCs may have died of this plague, or some contacts, some major players that people had, a merchant that they particularly liked. And we'll talk about killing NPCs in a good way in a minute. But you want to have this historical dimension affect the emotional connections to that location, the physical connection to the location. So it's going to like texturally feel like a different place, even though as the GM, you think it's just one of many more cities. And similarly, you want it to change the mechanics sometimes. You don't always have to. If you run a mechanics light type party, it's okay to forego that one. But something like maybe making a constitution save, or you get some kind of a fever. You may not get the plague, but the party there's just so much sickness around that their immune system is just on sort of full burn. And so they're sort of suffering levels of exhaustion, or they need to rest longer. They get sick every now and then, stuff like that. So you can have this historical dimension affect, the mechanical as well. So big and small changes. You've got your overarching, what's different about this place? What's the event that happened that makes this setting or this location different from the last time? And then how does that actually play out? What are the little details that change that place? Knowledge checks is a cool way. Let's do updates in absentia. No, okay, we'll do knowledge checks first. So one way to try and have your cake and eat it too. If you're a GM who's got a big world, you got a whole lot of locations you want the party to go to, you really just can't bring yourself to send them to the same city because there's other cool cities to go to. One thing that you can do is when the party is entering somewhere that they've never been before, they've never been to this location, you can give them information about what it should be like, or what the most recent historical record says this city is like, so that when they see it for the first time and it's different, they'll be aware of this discontinuity, this sort of difference in historical time. So if they're entering, the sunken temples for the first time, they've never been there, deliberately give them information, knowledge checks, whatever mechanic you want to sort of use for this. Give them information on what the sort of common knowledge everybody knows. The sunken temple has a whole lot of moss. There's a weird lizard people, all these different features. That's what you can expect. And then when they get there, it's all cleaned up. The moss is all gone. There's no sign of lizard people. There's all these different features that don't align with when they succeed on the knowledge check. So again, players, when they think they've succeeded on a mechanical roll, they're like, oh, cool, I'm getting objective hard details. But you can give them the best that anyone would have had. If you were outside of this setting, this location, you weren't living there, you would think this is correct and this is right, this is how it should be. And so then when it's not, you're aware that something's out of sync. Something's happened. There's been an event that happened off screen that we have no idea about. And now the party is sort of confronted with that difference. Even though they were never there in the first place, giving them the knowledge of what it would have been like had they been there will emphasize that change. And the last one, updates in absentia. This is just if you really don't have the time, or you've got too many settings, you don't want to take the party back to an old city, you can just have them get updates about something that's happened in an old city. So let's say the first village that your party adventures through, they kill all the goblins, they're proud to have saved the village, they've got this soft spot for the mayor, they go off on adventures for 10 or 12 sessions, and then the sort of army is building, and the bigger plot is developing, and they get a report from the local duke who says, I know you've got this connection to the city. We've heard of when you first started out as a group, you helped them with their goblin problem. We just wanted to let you know there was some bad news. They were recently sacked by like a band of ogres, and very few people got out alive. So affect the world, or affect the location, like make the location recur to the players without them having to go there. So just bring them a courier, bring them a guy with a letter who tells them that something has changed, so that they feel that that location has been affected by time, not affected by them, if that makes sense. So that's some tips on rocking recurring locations. Again, not exhaustive, but cool ways that you could think about how do I change a setting and use the setting to show that time happens without the party necessarily influencing it. So the next and most obvious, which we shouldn't need to spend a lot of time on, is recurring NPCs. Of course, recurring NPCs are a favorite. As a GM, as a basic principle, you can always expect your party members are going to become irrationally and extravagantly and absurdly attached to your NPCs that you never expected them to be attached to. You will give them what you think is like the NPC who has all of the secrets, and he's super compelling and interesting, and you're going to want them to be invested in him, and they're not going to give a shit, and they're going to go and suddenly become extremely protective of the cobbler, the guy who's making their shoes, or they're going to be doing something with a completely different NPC. So expect, like very surely expect that there will be at least one PC per 3 or 4 sessions that your party becomes very interested in, that you had no idea mattered, and that you didn't plan for this NPC to really be any kind of a fixture. So because players are they gravitate so easily towards NPCs. NPCs are a really useful tool to emphasize time in a game. Not just sort of in the immediate, but because they're a little bit more mobile. If you don't like having players go back to a city, have the NPC move a little bit if you want to. So Banes and Boons, to borrow some Open Legend terminology, which you can check out at openlegendrpg.com. Thank you for the follow, Joseph Rector. You were a gentleman and a scholar, and it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us this evening in our Dungeon Masters workshop. We're talking about how to emphasize time moving in a session as a GM, how to make your game setting feel like the world is real and goes on regardless of what your party does. So we're talking about time and the historic dimension of D&D. So Banes and Boons change the NPC. So once your party has inevitably fallen in love or become obsessed with suspicion with one of your NPCs, make note of it. Okay, this session, my recap notes, they really, really gave a shit about Joe Schmo who matters not to the story. Make a note of it and plan at some point in the future to have them re-encounter that NPC, but he can't be the same. Something has to have changed. So Banes or Boons, maybe he got roughed up, again, nothing to do with what the party did, or maybe it was something to do with what the party did. Maybe he came into some wealth, maybe he suddenly became more popular because he was somehow associated with this party of heroes. Positives or negatives, anything on the spectrum that could have affected this NPC while they were gone, so he seems different. Now, instead of just like physical or material differences, you look at him, he's missing an arm, or he has a new arm, things like that. Think about their disposition. So players will often remember not just the physical aspects or the mechanical, narrative function of the NPCs. They'll remember like the interaction. They'll remember what that conversation was like. Was this guy like really short? Did he have a bad attitude? Was this woman particularly well-spoken and articulate? They're going to remember those social aspects as well, so change those. Maybe you had a physical event happen that no longer is visible. Maybe your shoemaker got beaten up in a big way because of the party's association with him, got beat up by some of the thugs that the party ousted, got beat up when the party left. The party comes back, all the bruises are gone, but their like chipper, happy-go-lucky shoe cobbler is now much more reticent, he's much more turned inward, and he's particularly not interested in being seen with the party again. So you have your NPCs change either because or not because of something your party has done, but the change can be social as well as physical, and your party will pick up on that, they'll register that. I didn't mention killing the NPC because that's the most apparent way. Killing an NPC is great. I wouldn't do it all the time, but every once in a while, it can be a great way to remind the party that the world doesn't revolve around them. And as the GM, your job is not to give them the opportunity to make every important decision in the world. There are lots of important things that happen in the world that the party just never gets the chance to try and intervene one way or the other. I'm not even talking alignments here. I'm just saying things happen and you're not even there to respond. And that's what you can emphasize super easily by just killing a damn NPC. Now, I said killing them softly, and all I mean by that is killing the NPC in a way that has nothing to do with the plot or the story that the players were involved in. Joseph Rector hit it right on the head. People die, have the NPCs die in a normal way. That is exactly what killing them softly means. You know, if the party leaves and they're in this big sort of historic battle with this dragon and this army, and, you know, the city is overtaken and, you know, the NPC that they love happens to be one of them, one of the casualties that was killed, then they're going to associate the death with a decision that they made. But if the NPC is just dead, then they're going to feel that extra kick in the nuts of like, oh my God, there was nothing I could have done. Like, he was robbed for his coin purse and that's it. And we were out of town. That's all. So killing them softly is an especially like sharp way for the GM to like remind the PCs that like they're not the center of the universe. And I don't think it's strictly a malicious thing. It can be fun. But it's something that emphasizes that the setting that they're playing in is more immersive than they think, because it's not just catered to their blind spots. Like, it's not just what they can see. There's a whole lot of other stuff going on. And then have them come to you, sort of the throwaway. I talked about it a little bit at the beginning, similar to how you don't want locations to necessarily be somewhere that you return to if you've got this huge map. If you want to tell the party that an NPC has been changed by something off screen, you can have the NPC go to the party in a way that the location can't, with the exception of the sort of courier option that we talked about. If you have the courier show up and say, oh, the city has been attacked by ogres, XYZ. Similar, you can have that NPC show up needing help, or show up wanting vengeance, producing a nemesis. One thing that I've always really enjoyed doing is tracking when an adventuring party, creates antagonistic enough relationships that like there could be a legitimate nemesis, but always being aware of the fact that in a lot of those cases, the nemesis is nowhere near like even worth their time in a real fight. And those can be some really interesting encounters when you have an NPC show up with a couple hired thugs trying to kill the party because they ruined their life. And the party is just super aware right away at the beginning that like they're going to absolutely decimate this guy. Do we really want to kill him? Like, yes, he's attacking us first. Yes, he is trying to kill us, but it's just pathetic. Like he's not gonna, it's not gonna scratch any of us. We're seasoned adventurers, and that can be a fun like role play to try and like talk through it, or trying to have the party, convince this guy that he shouldn't be, trying to kill them, etc. Yeah. So that's a way to have the NPCs come to them as a nemesis, but not necessarily as an intimidating one. Not every nemesis becomes a lich, I guess, is the underlying principle. Joseph Rector says another option is to have their actions mean for long-term and have long-term bad effects. Absolutely. We're going to talk about like plot points as well. We've got two more ways that you can enhance or emphasize the time dynamic in your game. We've talked about locations. We've talked about NPCs. Now we're going to talk about downtime. So downtime is one that I like to use. It's depending on your party, it can take some different shapes and different forms, but it can be really useful either at a lull within a campaign. So a lot of people think of downtime as like, oh, you do that between campaigns. You say, okay, you just finished a campaign, you killed the big baddie, you got the big, prize. Let's like role play through, everybody like plan, what would your character do with like 2 months off? We're all going to meet back at this tavern, and you'll have the opportunity to have that sort of off-screen engagement with the world between your campaigns. But you can use it just as easily. Within a campaign. You just have these sort of lulls where you say you've got a couple weeks, you're in a central location on the map, whatever investments or emotional connections or responsibilities, obligations you have, like now's the time before we go off to the north and adventure through the Arctic for months. Now's the time to like just go check on whatever you might want to check on. So using downtime can be a way to like throw the party off screen, if that makes sense, because you're going to tell everyone, you know, before the session, plan what your off screen is going to be. Yeah, the infamous 5-year break in Dragonlance. Great books. You know, you tell your players, you know, at the start of the session, we're just going to go around the table and talk about what our downtime was for our player. What do we do in those 3 weeks, those 3 months, those 3 years, 5 years? Then when they come back and go around the table, like they're describing actions that happened off screen. So like right away, immediately, this is the world and story that doesn't sit within like the horse blinders of the party's adventuring quest. So downtime inherently emphasizes that the world is bigger than just what we're doing as adventurers. Large intervals, like I said, can emphasize it even more, giving party members the opportunity to do things like manage property. I've had a lot of really positive responses from in a number of groups that I've run. Managing businesses, working on trades, studying in academies, things like that. Lots of cool stuff, lots of creative ways you can mechanically, physically, and emotionally, you know, roll out and unpack those downtime events that the players choose. You can sort of work with them back and forth on what you want to have happen. And it's just always right away going to give you that sense of downtime. And then describing the changes sort of during and after. So the during, like I said, when they're doing something off screen and they're describing that at a table, like the experience as a player is you're describing off screen stuff, that immediately emphasizes time in a big way, that the world is sort of historically bigger than just your party. And then the after stuff too is now you've got all of these like plot points, locations, NPCs, events, decisions, actions the players have taken, all of this stuff that's happened off screen that you can now use to populate your courier messages. You know, your NPCs showing up because something's happened. You've now got all these personalized sets of events and connections that you can weave into the story as the campaigns keep rolling through your setting, which can be cool. So downtime is a good one. And now we're going to talk, last but certainly not least, about plot decisions. So plot decisions are the historical component, or the sort of the world is bigger than your party dimension to plot points, is the one that's always kind of operating. So in one sense, it's the one that needs the least amount of direct attention as a GM for it to function, for it to do some of that, you know, work of reminding the players that the world is bigger than they are. But that doesn't mean there aren't ways that you can specifically, in a catered way, try and emphasize it within the plot decisions. So looking at just like the primary consequence stuff, you know, the path the party took, before I start talking about forks. When you just look at, you know, you give the party a quest, they move through it, they expand sort of through, they make big decisions, and they save or don't save the world in some way or another, whatever your sort of major arc is. Afterwards, whether it's the next session, the next campaign, you're going to end up with lots of changes to the world. So that's the most apparent one. Like very few GMs think about this like consciously, but they do it anyway. At the end of a campaign, they're going to go back to that hometown, and like people are going to interact with them differently because they're now more heroic. There's this story about them of this thing they did. The evil warlord is going to collapse, and now the town is in a period of rebuilding, so there's a lot more construction. All these little things that most GMs just do sort of instinctively. But that's only really emphasizing the sort of historical breadth of your setting based on the decisions that your party made and the actions that they took. You can also look at the actions that they don't take. And a lot of times GMs and PCs more so don't realize that every decision to do something is a decision not to do many other things. And that's kind of implicit in every action that the players take. So the decision to try and wade across the rapids is implicitly a decision not to scout ahead to see if there's a bridge, not to cut down a tree and try and make a bridge, not to go back to town, work in a pub for 6 months, buy a scroll of flying, and then fly over the rapids, to take an extreme example. There's all these implicit like things that I didn't do built into the actions that you do take. So when you're designing obstacles and tasks for your party, you can build in some very apparent and explicit options that they're not going to be taking, so that they're much more aware of this fact that whenever they decide to do X, they're choosing not to do Y or Z. So give them forks, is the simple way to put it. Put forks in the road that can be either major or minor in terms of the story. So, you know, a minor fork would be, you know, you show them that it looks like there may be a bridge up the river, but way down here, you've got the best assortment of stones to get across these rapids. So what do you think? Choosing one is to not choose the other, because you're going to head off to the other one and neglect the other, and have like an event or a consequence, something to happen while they're gone. While they're off checking out the bridge, something's going to happen at the rocks. While they're on the rocks, someone's going to get robbed by some highwaymen on the bridge. That sort of thing, where when you've built a fork into the plot or into the story, and each option has consequences if the party are there and if they're not there. And they may not find those consequences out immediately, but they could. If, you know, in the river crossing example, if they choose to try and hop across the stones, then that means they're going to see like the sleeping bear's nest that they wouldn't have seen had they gone to the bridge. But while they're halfway across, they're going to hear the scream at the bridge, and they're just not going to have time. They're going to rush, they're going to scramble, they may try and go save whoever's screaming at the bridge being attacked by highwaymen. They're going to get there and they're going to find a body. She's already been, you know, robbed, killed, and left by the wayside. So they missed out on their opportunity to have done anything. So by building deliberate plot forks, where you have a planned consequence for the party's non-choice, the fork in the road that they neglect, that they turn away from, you've got consequences for that, then you're going to emphasize in a big way that, like, this world just keeps happening. It just keeps going. There's nothing you can do about it. There's very little you can do except with what's right in front of you. So that's like minor story arcs. Story arcs. There are also major story arcs that you can fork. Now this story arc in the background, always there, lurking. You can have major story arcs that fork as well. The only issue is that this tends to kind of stagger your GM prep. If you're going to plan major plot arcs that fork or diverge, then you're not going to be able to plan as in depth, unless you want to plan both arcs. You're not going to be able to plan as much in detail further into the campaign. You may have sort of how that campaign is going to start, what's the hook towards the end, you know, what's the main culminating event that they're going to have to encounter and deal with, and how they get there in between. If instead of just having one path, you provide them two paths, and then from that one path you provide two paths, you're not going to be able to plan as exhaustively, you know, the whole campaign before session one, because you need to know which path they choose to understand how those consequences are going to trickle around. But it can be really fun if you've got the time and you can sort of juggle all those, you know, if you've got good note-taking and you've got sort of a good grasp of your setting and understand who are all the players and what's the sort of timeline for this campaign. If you provide something like, so I'll give an example. If you know that the first major thing that the party is going to have to do is to explore the sunken temple, you know, with the lizard men or whatever. You know, they've got to explore the sunken temple, and you know that that's where you're going to plant the first clue to the cult that's sort of developing up in the mountains. And you know that like 3 or 4 sessions later, there's going to be 2 or 3 other clues, and eventually they're going to start to get a sense, and then there's going to be this final confrontation with the cult in the mountains. But when they're going to that first location, that first objective, it takes very little prep for that first session to say, okay, so you've been hired by, you know, you went to the tavern, there's a job board, hired by XYZ. You've been hired by the Jewelers Guild to go check out that temple. They've got a particular interest in some of the stones that may be there. They want it cleared if there's anything there. Very generic, you know, investigation before they start sending their technicians. They want it potentially cleared. They want to know if it's secure, and they can pay X amount of money. That's your job. Go, you know, figure out what it is that you need to do. Do whatever planning you like. And then 2 days before the party leaves, the Perfumers Guild approaches them in secret and says, we would like to pay you more for that job. We would not like you to clear it. We need you to do something else because there's a very rare flower that we need in that sunken temple. So Same GM prep for the Sunken Temple. You're going to have the same looking temple, the same enemies, same encounters, same traps, same like bulk mechanical shit for where the party's going to go, but they have two prongs that they can approach it from. And if they choose one guild over the other, there's going to be consequences. So by choosing the Alchemist Guild, for instance, the Perfumer's Guild is, or sorry, by choosing the Perfumer's Guild and not the Jeweler's Guild, whichever one they don't choose is gonna like fall into disarray or like financial disaster or catastrophe. Something's gonna happen because they can't sort of shore up whatever it is that they needed from that boon of having access to that temple. Maybe the jewelers are going to accidentally, unleash something by digging too deep 10 sessions down the road, which wouldn't have happened had you gone with the perfumers. Maybe the perfumers are going to start using some of those flowers to make like strange poisons, and then the city is going to be all taken over by weird like automatons controlled by flowers. And this is just all off the cuff, I'm just making this up, but the idea being that you've got consequences for not choosing one of the two, but in terms of prep, you're still just prepping a sunken temple. But give the parties two approaches, two forks to choose from, and have negative consequences for each. And not necessarily negative for the party, but just like there are negative consequences or important world consequences to which decision you go with. Now, I've used a similar example to that in a game that was mostly about like political intrigue and stuff, and we had multiple guilds, and I, again, going back to the other dimensions, mechanics, I developed a sort of mechanical system for tracking the hierarchy of guilds within a capital city. And there were a number of quests that the party could go through that slowly gave them clues to like a major, fairly tropic, high fantasy, earth-shattering arc that they were working towards. But in the process, every little adventure they went on was for or against one of the guilds. And they got to pick and choose between, I think, 9 or 10 of them, all these different relationships they could develop. But also they were directly influencing the up and down of which guild was in which position. And that ended up having huge consequences when certain things happened in that city, when the sort of power dynamics started to come to friction. Eventually the city was under siege, and whatever level of influence each guild was at determined how much resource they could expend to help defend the city, what they could bring in or not, how likely they were to survive the siege afterwards. So that's a really complex version of multiple branches sort of expanding off of one another. But the simple principle is, if you want the party to go to X dungeon, give them 2 options to get there, same amount of prep to prep the dungeon, come up with a couple ideas on what are the consequences for not going one way or the other. And then when they come back from that dungeon, they're going to feel like, okay, we did the dungeon. We focused on what was in front of the party, accomplished the task, did the objective. Yes, there's going to be consequences in that the dungeon is now empty, or we killed the old guy who begged for mercy, whatever, they'll understand their personal consequences. But when they get back to where they got their objective and see that even just choosing how they went to the dungeon or under whose blessing, that also had consequences. And immediately they're going to understand that things happen off screen that they have no control over, and that there's very little that they can do to stop from happening. You don't have the choice to work for both guilds. If you've got a really intriguey sort of political party that like wants to work for both guilds in that sort of simplified example, then you'll have to be more creative in how you narrativize these forks to make sure that they're clear forks, that doing one always does preclude the possibility of doing the other. And that'll give you a strong sense in your world of things happening off screen. So those are sort of four ways that I like to use, 4 things that I like to do in campaigns to emphasize that the world happens outside of the sort of scope of what the party experiences. And that makes the world seem bigger. We'll go back to this one. Makes the world seem bigger to the party. How's it going, Y guy? Makes the world seem bigger. It makes the story really compelling to the party because they've got this huge amount of influence on the decisions that they can make, but also they'll have this inverse lack of influence on certain things that they're not even there for when they change or happen. And in either scenario, with increase or decrease in influence, they're going to care more about what it is that they're doing because they've got to be a lot more careful, and they've got to try and do their best to navigate that sort of huge storm of forces and things and agencies that are operating in the world that aren't just the party with the little light above their head, which is the GM following them. So ways to make sure that that time, that sort of historical dimension to your game, not just the mechanical or the physical or the emotional, is always being sort of emphasized, using recurring locations, changing locations, recurring NPCs, and changing those NPCs, killing them softly with your song. Downtime, give the party the opportunity to describe their own off-screen events, so they realize, okay, off-screen is just a thing, like the world is bigger than our particular quest and my next magic item. And branching plot decisions. So either if you just want to have a single plot decision and make sure to have a strong web of consequences that get revealed over time, or if you want to try forking a little bit and remind the party that choosing how to do a certain quest is not just going to influence the quest itself, but it's going to influence, everything around it. So that's me. That's all I got. We try to keep these workshops nice and tight for the YouTubes, for when we edit them and throw them up for reference. So if you came in towards the end, if you didn't see the whole thing, if you were here but you missed part of something that you'd love to go back and hear again, this video will be on the YouTubes. You can always check it out and reference at encounterroleplay.com. We'll have all of our content as well, but youtube.com/encounterroleplay is where you'll find this video. If you haven't hit that follow button, I frankly don't know. I mean, we roleplay over 100 hours a week of Dungeons & Dragons, Numenera, Dark Heresy, Open Legend, all these great systems. We put a lot of time into streaming, and we love playing D&D for an audience. So tune into one of our shows, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like 6 hours a day. So there's got to be somewhere that you can tune in. We don't expect you to watch all of them. Pick one you like and hang out. Or come hang out on our website, encounterroleplay.com. We've got a lot of cool stuff for you to catch up on previous seasons. If you want to read up on the characters we're playing, what's the story so far in some of our campaigns. If you're not sure which show to pick, which show you'd like to tune in and try out, you can find out all that information there. Lots of articles. If you like this DM tip stuff, you can check out our RPG content section of the website. Same guy who writes these. This guy, tries to write some articles every week. Quintus is right. For $1 a month, you can support us on Patreon. Every ounce counts. This is a lot of work putting together this much content. So it's always great to have the support of you guys. We've had a lot of support in the last few months. And it's helped us do things like expand our website and, write more of these articles. So it's been great. You can head to patreon.com/encounterroleplay to see how you can support us there. I think that's it.